So hello, welcome everybody. Dr. Keltner is a prolific researcher in areas of social psychology and emotion. He has published over 190 scientific articles. He's written for the New York Times Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, the London Times, and Utne Reader, and he's received numerous national prizes and grants for his research. Dr. Keltner is the co-author of 2 textbooks, as well as the best-selling author, the author of the best-selling Born to Be Good, The Science of a Meaningful Life, and The Compassionate Instinct. Additionally, he has another book scheduled to come out, I believe, just next month from Penguin, titled The Power Paradox, How We Gain and Lose Influence, and I'm sure it will be an entertaining and informative read. He is full professor at UC Berkeley, director of the Berkeley Social Interaction Lab, and faculty director of the Greater Good Science Center. As we will hear about shortly, he has served as a consultant for Pixar's Inside Out. He has worked at Facebook and Google on emotion-related projects, and Wired Magazine recently rated Dacher's podcast from his course Emotion as one of the 5 best educational downloads. For these reasons, and for many others, Dacher was the first person I thought of, and that is also why we are so fortunate to have him here today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dacher Keltner.
Well, thank you, Ethan. And let me just make sure we're working here. All right. It is great to be here. I think my first conference presentation was at WPA way back in the 1980s when I was a graduate student. I was wearing shorts and flip-flops. My hair was about as long as Ethan's. And I'm almost positive we used to do these transparencies, and mine were hand-drawn. So this is, it was a different era. So it's great to be here, and it's so great to see so many young scholars and also so many people of color. So this is an honor to be here. So today, what I'd like to talk to you about is a little adventure that I kind of unwittingly went on 6 years ago, which is to be a scientific consultant on the film Inside Out. You guys have seen the film? Or some of you have seen the film? That's how. And wherever I go and people tell me stories about Inside Out and how it influenced their lives, I make sure I pass them on to Pete Docter and Ronnie Del Carmen. Pete's the director. As I'll talk to you about Ronnie, one of the first Filipino major film creators, and now a sensation thanks to the film in Southeast Asia. He's kind of a rock star. I make sure I tell them the stories that people tell me about what Inside Out did to their lives. It was a pretty interesting experience. So as Ethan said, really for my career, I've been toiling away studying human emotion. It's one of my major foci in my research. And for 20 years, I taught human emotion at UC Berkeley, had a podcast and the like. And it really is my life's love. I think it's one of the most fascinating. I think it is really what makes humans human and mammals mammals, and it really is what the spirit of life is about, is to the emotions of living. And one day, I just want to see, my microphone works out here? Or can you guys hear me? Okay, dang. So one day, this guy called me up, and I had known Pete Docter from a conference that we had been on together. We were sort of casual friends. And he, of course, is a director at Pixar. He did Monsters, Inc. He did Up. I think the montage of Carl and Ellie as they describe their relationship is one of the best portrayals of love I have ever seen on the screen. And Pete called me up, and there he is doing his discussion. By the way, as he became well known as a director of this movie, everywhere he would go, when I went to the screening in Hollywood, they're like, "Pete, show us your emotions." And so he got very good at disgust expressions. So Pete called me up out of the blue, and he said, "Hey, Dacher, this is Pete Docter." It's like, "How you doing, Pete?" It's like, "Hey, I'd love to do a movie. I'm working on my next movie." And I'm like, "Well, good for you." And I'm thinking about doing a movie about human emotion. I was like, it's about time. And I'm really interested in how emotions govern how we see the world, or as Jean-Paul Sartre, the philosopher, said, they produce these magical transformations in what we see and what we remember. And I'm also interested in a movie that really characterizes how emotions govern our social interactions inside out, right? And it's like, Pete, that's how you would distill what we've learned in the science of emotion down to one complicated phrase, which is emotions govern our inside and outside lives. So I'm on board. And furthermore, I'd love to do this story about the emotions of my main character will be an 11-year-old girl as she goes through the turmoil of being a preteen and leaving her beloved home in Minnesota and moving to San Francisco. And I'd really love your help on understanding the emotions of a young 11-year-old girl. And I was like, I'll see you later, Pete. Now, there's a subtext, which is that Pete, as he talks about it in the movie, was inspired by the emotional transformations of his daughter, Ellie, and in particular, that preteen phase where girls start to be pushed around by prepubescent hormones and emotions, and it gets very complicated. At the same time as we were doing this movie, both Pete and my daughters were 11 and 12 years old, so it was this personal inquiry. Ronnie Del Carmen, the other creative force behind the movie, likewise has a whole family of daughters, and so this movie became, in a sense, thinking about daughters too, which was really interesting. So that was really the challenge of the movie about 6 years ago when Pete reached out. So let me just tell you what happened. People, when Pete first approached me, I thought, finally, maybe they'll use my voice for one of the characters. That I have a lisp, and so that was improbable. Maybe I'll get to write a little dialogue. No, that's not a good idea either. I'm a social scientist. Maybe I'll get to do a little drawing. I've got some weird drawings here of the unconscious. And no, they've got a lot of talent handling that stuff. So in a way, it was a really interesting exercise in starting to realize what my role was in this movie. So what happened, as some of you probably know, or many of you probably know, Pixar takes about 5 years to make a movie. It begins with 2 people. It's almost like producing an empirical paper, actually, with a little bit more firepower. They start with a couple of people who have ideas, and they're drawing, and it was Pete and Ronnie, just drawing characters, sketches, what would disgust look like. Disgust started out really ugly looking and really heinous and kind of witch-like, and really transformed into the Mindy Kaling character. And so they began, and I would say every 9 months or so, I would go to Pixar and really just do largely scientific presentations, right? Here's what we know about the nervous system and emotion. Here's what we know about the facial expression, the voice. Memory was a big theme in their talk, and I referred to the very important work of Linda Levine at UC Irvine. That was spectacular. It was just, and I remember, I'll get into my messages here, but I remember, there are always struggles, especially with Pete, in really producing the kinds of movies that he produces. Usually about 2/3 the way in, there's a crisis in the movie, as is often the case. And I remember visiting about 3 years into the production of the movie as they go from storyboards and drawings to more complex computer-based drawings to layers of animation where they're just using their kind of sort of cutting-edge computer animation firepower. And I saw all the imagery of the islands of the personality and the train of thought and what the emotions look like, and I knew they were onto something really incredible. So I visited a lot. Pete, I was just stunned how seriously he took the science. He would email me at all hours of the day. I remember he was going to debate. They do these worldwide tours with the films, and he was going to debate a Russian neuroscientist. And he's like, you got to tell me what all the neurochemicals are. I'm going toe-to-toe with this guy. So I sent him, chapters from our textbook. And he read them, unlike, no comment. Got to go to a lot of screenings, got to meet some of the cast, sit next to Mindy Kaling. Bill Hader's a lot better looking than you might imagine. Really handsome, good looking guy. And what was really striking, and I'm just giving you a sense of, during those visits, and I'll get to kind of the core scientific themes of the film. It was really striking, like the first question they asked me is, how many emotions are there? And we've seen a revolution in the field of emotion from the Ekman 6. Now the field is moving toward, say, 15 to 18 states. I pitched them hard on 18 states, and they're like, Dacher, you've never written a story in your life, have you? I'm like, no, you got to have 18 states in her mind. And they're like, that would be chaos. That's not fiction, And I'll tell you about, I pitched them, I was like, well, what emotions are you going to do? And they actually, you are some of the first to hear this. They had a lot of other emotions that kind of made trial runs at the movie. They drew up surprise. It was too close to fear. They had pride in the movie for a while, hit the cutting board. They had a laughter character, but then it got really weird because you kind of laugh at the movie, and now there's this laughter guy, and so those characters didn't make it. I, of course, biased in my own way, pitched them on awe. I'm like, awe is such a fascinating emotion. You should have it in there. And they're like, now, what how would you do that? I do think they'll make a sequel when Riley is a teenager, and we're going to see a lot of awe. So that'll be interesting. I pitched them on compassion, didn't make it, so that was fun. Some of the big questions where science was really useful had to do with memory. And the movie really, in a fundamental way, is about memory and what is consciousness and how do we remember the past. And there, Linda Levine, working at UC Irvine, is Linda in the room? Or it's such important work that our current emotions guide what we think about the past, and that just becomes a fundamental notion in the movie. They were very interested in what is the emotional life of a 11-year-old girl like? And one of the things that I conveyed to them, I'll talk about in a second, is we now know one of the more, as Sonia knows, our happiness superstar, that girls really take a dive in their well-being when they're about 11 or 12, and it really bottoms out at 14, 15. So I think that's part of the resonance of the film. So there were just all of really fascinating questions. So what I'd like to do today with that preamble, and then we'll have good time for your own questions about the film and observations, is talk to you about kind of the big meta themes in the film that really make contact with the science of emotion, and as I've seen the movie several times and watched it develop, and then really see the cultural response to it. The film, it was so fascinating watching, suddenly right about now, their PR team said, it comes out June 19, you're going to help it, you're going to talk to the media about, your role, and I was like, sure, I'll be around. And all good friends, and they didn't know what it would do, and they were worried for a lot of reasons. Some of the senior executives at Pixar felt that it was too sad, which I think actually proved to be the revolutionary dimension to the movie. And then, when the movie came out, something called Jurassic World, or whatever it was, like this big dinosaur movie, just ate up the world. And they were like, oh my God, we're coming out next week. And I was like, that's not my problem. That is your problem. So, and I really think it was a sensation. It was the largest opening weekend of any non-sequel ever, right? All the big blockbusters are sequels. This was a new movie, and it was the largest opening box office. It was the best reviewed movie of that year by serious critics, beating all the Oscar winners. I thought it was the best movie of the year, maybe Spotlight. Who cares about my opinion on that one? But it was even bigger than that, in that I think it was this cultural moment, and it was a sensation. One of the early reviewers, and then I'm going to get into this, said that in a way this was, and this is in the Atlantic Monthly, said that Inside Out was a little bit like Dante's Inferno, which is a text that envisioned hell. And here was Inside Out that, it really, I think, is the most sophisticated portrayal of the human mind that we've ever had on the screen, and just taking on the complexities of memory and consciousness and emotion and judgment and rationality. So in a way, I think it really changed how our culture thinks about that. How so? Well, when I teach human emotion, and it's really clear, we've long thought that emotions are destructive and irrational and maladaptive for the human endeavor. And that is just a deep assumption in a lot of Western thought. Plato thought that reason should be the masters of emotion. The Stoical philosophers thought that really we should rid ourselves of passion. We should purify ourselves, and then we'll really be able to function in society. The Puritans who founded this culture were no friends to human emotion, as you might imagine. And there are exceptions out there, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. David Hume, A Theory of Moral Sentiments, is really about how emotions guide our moral judgments. Charles Darwin was, of course, foundational. And I think the movie really countered this idea that emotions are disruptive and dysfunctional. It's so interesting. One of the ways to speak to how deeply embedded this view is of emotions as being irrational and dysfunctional is to just look at how we talk about emotions and the metaphors that we use for emotions. This is characterized by my colleague at Berkeley, George Lakoff. We tend to think of emotions in our language and describe them as kind of destructive forces in human life, right? So we talk about beauty as a force. Wow, she knocked me off my feet. We talk about sexual desire as hunger. We talk very often about our emotions as destructive natural forces, right? I'm overwhelmed with grief. I'm wrestling with my jealousy, right? My love is getting the best of me, right? As if they're antagonists. And I think that's actually a very outdated notion that Inside Out helped disabuse us of. So Inside Out, and we'll get into this, really tells us that here are the four themes I'd like to talk about that I saw come to life in the film in response to the science. The first is stop this dualism. There are the emotions out there, and then there's you or your mind or your soul or reason. You are your emotions. Second point, and I'll give you science and a little scene on this. Emotions, as the great ethologist Irenaeus Eibelsfeld said, are the grammar of social living. If you take out your emotional exchanges in life, you don't have much left, right? And Inside Out was a brilliant portrayal of that. I'll tell you about my favorite scene. Let's stop this emphasis on suppressing emotion, putting aside emotion. Emotions are bad for us, and the like. And Inside Out, I think the most important lesson is it taught us to embrace negative emotions like sadness. I had a dad after I was doing yoga come up to me. And he's a CIO, a chief information officer, very successful guy. We're sitting in the locker room. I won't describe it. And he's like, man, I heard you helped out with Inside Out. I was like, well, a little bit. It's like, so if I take this correctly, what you're saying with this movie is, he starts tearing up, like, it's okay to be sad every now and then? I'm like, it's okay to be sad. And it's like, oh man, that's too much, And I think that that was a common reaction. And then happiness is found in a rich mixture of emotions that you see brilliantly portrayed in the film. Okay, so, and this I don't want to bore you with the science, we'll pick this up, but this comes out of 25 years of science. So first up is, and I'll just sort of highlight some of the things we've done in our lab, and then sort of bring in sort of the themes of this. The first idea that we talked with and we really grappled with is like, well, what's the place of emotion in the human psyche? And I think that it's fair to say, when you just look at some of the big literatures in the field, that one way to think about identity is it's the mixture of emotions that you are, through culture and upbringing and your genetics, predisposed to feel. You are your emotions. I feel, therefore I am. We know this from the literature on temperament, right? Jerome Kagan, Avshalom Caspi, and others, just showing, wow, if you are an inhibited, fearful person, as I have been through my life, that'll really define what your identity is like in almost every way, from the work you do to the kind of relationships you have. We know this from the family attachment literature of Phil Shaver, Mario Mikulencer, inspired by John Bowlby. If you're securely attached and feel love and connected, that has a massive influence on how you experience the world. You are your emotions. Most poignantly in the movie, and this was really, this was a revolutionary idea for Inside Out and Pete Dacher and Ronnie Del Carmen and the team, which is your attempt to imagine the past. And in many ways, Pete Dacher, who has had, and he doesn't mind my saying this, he's a dear friend, had experiences of loss, experiences of sadness, moving in 5th grade, like Riley did, to Denmark. And he really grappled with this question of, like, how do I think about the past? Pete, like a lot of parents, was watching his kids get older and wondering about how you reflect on their childhood, right? It's just a basic developmental passage. And the question is, how do we bring back the past? And Linda Levine and other scientists have shown you see the past through the lens of your current emotion, right? That's what those memories are. And it's so phenomenally well portrayed in those balls that represent memories. I thought they were spectacular. We study the vagus nerve in my lab, which is this neurophysiological structure in your autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic, helps you connect to others. And we've got 20 studies, 20 data sets replicating, showing if you have elevated vagal tone, you just kind of are connecting to the world more. You help people more. You feel integrated into social communities. You are your emotions. I told them about this crazy study I did with yearbook photos, and of course they love the visuals, where we coded the photos of women from the Ravenna Helsons Mills College study, 1958. 2 muscle movements, the pulling up of the zygomaticus major in the lips, and then the contraction of the orbicularis oculi around her eye. You can see the action of that muscle in that sort of bulging lower eyelid. She would get a high score of a warmer smile. Here's somebody who has, you can't quite see the activity. We didn't control for hairstyle, by the way, but that's, we should have, I now realize, not quite as warm. And I showed Pete and his team, I was like, look, your joy in a photo, a single millisecond in 1958, tells us, controlling for a lot of factors, how you handle stress. You're less stressed out. You feel more happy at age 52, or bottom correlation. You're feeling more engaged in the world. You are your emotions. There are a lot of data now coming out just showing how different traits in Oliver John and others, Big Five, are rooted in core emotional tendencies. And I've given you some highlights here. It's not terribly surprising, but it tells you, for example, openness to experience, and people who love art and new ideas, probably a lot of people in this room, really have these high levels of awe and interest and curiosity and laugh a lot at things that other people don't laugh at, right? And they're just intellectually engaged in the world. Emotions define our core identities. And of course, that becomes a central theme in the movie of just thinking about the prominence of joy as Riley's defining emotion, the way that emotions color the past. This was a spectacular scene where Riley starts to look at this soccer event or hockey event through sadness's eyes and realizes, wow, there was a other part to the memory I didn't even see till I take on this emotion. And then the struggle between Riley and joy and sadness about how we think about these core memories and our identity. You are your emotions. Next stop is on how the science guided the film. Is really a very important theme to me, and I think it's a kind of a revolution, and Jess Tracy and I are working on a theoretical paper, and I've written a lot about this with John Haidt and Ann Kring and others. You know, in science, we've done a funny thing, which is 95% of our studies of emotion involve people by themselves sitting in a laboratory room, looking at a computer screen, you know, having little electrodes attached to them, with an experimenter coming on, like, okay, rate on a 7-point scale, how do you feel? Yeah. And you're watching like a video. And that, I think that's a massive misrepresentation of emotion. It's necessary for scientific control, but emotions are profoundly social. In fact, I hope you, and I talked a lot about this and had a whole visit to Pixar. In the 1960s, as the field of emotion got off the ground, there was another group of scientists who were working in Europe, and they're called ethologists. And they're led by Irenaeus Eibelsfeld and Wolf Schiefenhovel. And what these guys did, Sarah Blaffer-Hurdy later, these are teams of scholars influenced by people like Konrad Lorenz, a European approach to human emotion. And whereas Americans went into the lab, European scholars in the 60s went out into the wild. And these scholars traveled to, in the 60s, almost all of the continents that had remote peoples living in the small groups of 50 to 100 people, living in the social conditions in which we evolved for several 100,000 years. And they would travel to the Amazon and sub-Saharan Africa and Indonesia, and they would film them, and they have hundreds of thousands of hours of people in their social lives, right? And if you look at the footage, you will see these patterns of human social life that look exactly like our human social life. And there are patterns of soothing babies and reducing distress, patterns of attachment, patterns of play, little siblings playing with toys that are, not toys, but little objects nearby. Lots of stuff on flirtation. You'll see people reconciling in the face of conflict, right? You'll see people negotiating status and getting ready for confrontation. And Irenaeus Eibelsfeld, in his 1989 book, Human Ethology, said, when I look at social life, emotions are the grammar of social living, right? When we court and flirt and fall in love, that is a sequence of emotional exchanges. And you can identify them. We haven't done that very well scientifically, but they charted this descriptively. Just to give you a sort of a sense of this, this is just a little sequence. This blew my mind when I was starting my research on embarrassment. This is somebody from sub-Saharan Africa, very little contact with the West, and they're laughing at a joke, and you see the beautiful laughter in the upper right-hand corner. Then they realize the joke is about them, and they get embarrassed on the bottom left, right? Millisecond by millisecond. And when I saw that, I was like, I've embarrassed 10,000 people in U.S. labs, and I'm going to probably burn in whatever for that. But no, you know, and that's exactly what I see in our studies, is that exact facial muscle pattern. So emotions are not only inside us, they structure our interactions. So you guys know this science. I'll move quickly. That really, you know, was the thinking of Charles Darwin. There's Paul Ekman in the 60s in New Guinea, where he gathered his now well-known data. That's a picture of one of the Fuegans that Darwin got to travel around with from the Tierra del Fuego. And we've learned that there are all these emotions like disgust and fear and sadness and embarrassment. I won't bore you. We did a lot of work, and I told the Pixar team about how embarrassment produces forgiveness and reconciliation. And so if you make a big mistake today or giving a talk, just get embarrassed and show your neck, and people, you know, like, right there, man, you can kill me, but I know you won't, and in fact, you'll like me more, and, you know. So there you go. Jess Tracy has studied pride, where you expand your chest. Maybe you'll see some of this if you're younger in the audience, flirting going on at the conference. If it really escalates, you'll see some of this lip puckers, which are associated with desire. John Gonzaga did that work. And lip licks. If you see lip licks, I won't describe what's going to happen. And lip bites. And when people fall in love, they get all drugged out and they tilt their heads. And then when you're really feeling warm and loving, by the way, I don't know why I'm showing this to you, but as I studied love and desire with John Gonzaga, who was in my lab and now went to eHarmony and now works at Netflix, he turned down Ivy League offers. He was a pioneer. I don't know if he's in the audience, but he's a good friend. You know, just when John and I were doing this work on love and desire, which I will be in the sequel of Inside Out, I teach in these summer camps, and I was like, I got to test this on some young kids. So I said, hey, what do you look like when you feel love? And there's Austin Warren, who, on the far right, he's now going to college next year. In first grade, turning in a math assignment, he kissed my daughter on the cheek right in front of me. I'm like, this is math. What are you doing? And that's his love, which looks like vaudeville. And then, of course, women are always better at all emotions. This young girl totally nails it, even to the point, do you see how her little hand on the left is sort of tugging her pants and it's about to release and it's like, I feel love. And then there's that guy on the left-hand side. He's like, I was like, what do you feel like when you feel love? He's like, hey. I was like, man, you're 9 years old. I'm writing your parents and stay away from my daughter. I've done work that and there's somebody who was on my dissertation, Phil Zimbardo, who's and Phil, I'll tell stories about. We could talk if you have a Q. If you want to know how to be a successful professor and change the world like Phil has, ask me about how Phil behaves on a softball field. And he was a spectacular hitter in our day, but I love Phil. So I've studied the human voice. Our lab is doing a lot of work, spectacular modality of the grammar of social living. How about this one? This is just the voice has a lot more information with respect to emotion than the human face because of anatomical changes in our vocal apparatus. When we started to walk upright, our vocal chamber got bigger. We developed this dexterous tongue, and we have this incredible vocabulary of emotion in the human voice. I'm going to give you an assignment next time you watch Inside Out. I was blown away. In the mammalian world, non-human primates, when the two spectacular findings here from Charles Snowden in 2003 that will point to a little piece of Inside Out. When mothers of the great apes lose their babies, they will very routinely take them around with them as an act of grieving. They don't want to give up the baby. And these are all dead infants. Just as remarkably, think about this, other what we call conspecifics or friends nearby, when they see a mom that's lost a baby, will emit little sounds that are called coos that say, I feel sympathy for your loss, right? Unequivocally. So we, in my lab, have studied the richness of the human voice in how it conveys emotion. They're in what Klaus Scherer called vocal bursts. They're little sounds that we emit that have very powerful communicative possibilities of signaling emotion. Here's a sound I hear from my daughters who are now teenagers. See if you know what emotion they're conveying. I just did that to a bunch of government leaders from Hong Kong, and they knew right away, right? I'm going to count to 3, and I want to hear your best sympathy sound. 1, 2, 3. There we go. I recently did that at Goldman Sachs. Let me hear your best sympathy sound. 1, 2, 3. Silence. That's not a joke. 1, 2, 3. Try it again, you guys. I was like, there we go. What these data are, Dan Cordero, this paper is actually published now this year in Emotion, traveled to 11 countries, played sounds that are produced in Berkeley. We got a giant library of these. He went to remote Bhutan where no one's seen a Westerner, had any contact with the West. Eastern Bhutan is one of the last really remote places in the world. Chance guessing when judging these emotion signals is the dotted line. And you can see about 14 or 15 emotions, including sympathy on the far right, are really doing well in terms of communicating emotion. Some of you may know, and this is all building up to one of my favorite scenes of Inside Out. We also communicate emotion through tactile contact. It's this massively sophisticated system. You have cells in your skin that respond specifically to kinds of touch that send signals to your somatosensory cortex that tell you what you're experiencing. Simple acts of touch, like the chimp grooming, 15% of their days they do that. Slow lorises on the right have evolved one digit that it only uses to groom other slow lorises. Just the right kind of touch on the back rewards people, activates reward circuits, builds trust, signals you're in a safe place if you do it right. Girls who are patted on the back by their teachers are 5 times more likely to go to a blackboard to solve hard problems because the teacher's saying, you belong. And it's soothing. There are lots of cool studies showing it calms the HPA axis and cortisol. We did a crazy study, Matt Hertenstein in my lab, replicated a bunch of times, and you're going to see where this is all relevant, wherein we brought people to the lab, and one person sat on one side of a barrier, stuck their arm through the barrier, another person came in, we gave them a list of emotions, they tried to touch that forearm and communicate different emotions to the forearm. The person just felt that, and they guessed what happened. In the blue, you see how well they did compared to 8% chance guessing. We can convey compassion and gratitude and love and anger and a whole rich array of emotions just by half-second touches to the forearm. It's this amazing language of social connection. A couple of gender differences there. When women try to communicate anger to the male arm, he had no idea what she was doing. And when the man tried to communicate compassion to the female arm, she was like, was that even a human being? I don't know what that was. So, but for those of you studying clinical psychology, you can figure that one out. So one of my favorite scenes in Inside Out, and if you watch it, is that. And I thought it was such an incredible portrayal of the family, wherein Riley runs away in the peak of her anomie and distress, comes back. They have this great embrace, and that's a still from it. And then, I don't know if you recall this, but she also emits this incredible vocal burst, where she has this sigh that is both comforted, sort of embraced, and enthusiastic, right? It's this incredible sound that just encapsulates the narrative trajectory in the film. And I applaud them. Just a couple more ideas, and then we'll have some time for your own observations and questions. So there was this really interesting, and I don't know if you guys, how many of you know about this, but Pete was just telling me about this. So what happened in the development of the movie is they were building it up, and Pete had a lot of it sketched out and partially animated, where they're just, the bodies are just geometric forms and the like. And they had gotten the dialogue and they're getting stuff going. And they pitched their executive team probably every year. And I think it was about 3 years into the movie, they were gearing up, and Pete had this conflict with the executive team. And it was really a crisis. And the executive team wanted Joy to go through Riley's mind with fear, right? And that would have had a lot of gags. Fear was kind of funny, and and just how fear can be funny. It feels like it's weird, and you're doing crazy things. And Pete wanted it to be sadness, and fought very hard and was really almost ready to give up the film. But he really felt that the biggest opportunity artistically and the message that he had, and just thinking about the integrity of the film, was for Joy to travel through Riley's mind and make it back to the control tower with sadness. And he faced enormous resistance because they felt it was too sad of a movie, right? And I think had it not been sadness, I don't think it would have been anywhere near the movie that it was. What Pete started to learn, is, and I loved how the film really took this on. And in some, when I talked about the film to my Berkeley undergrads, I have this phenomenal student who's a little bit older, African-American guy. He was in the military, he was homeless for a while, now he's one of our honor students going to med school. And he said, man, that was one of the darkest movies I've ever seen, And that is incredible, and rightfully so. For those of you who have teenage girls, we know that anxiety just escalates, well-being drops precipitously, a sense of disconnect with the world. There was just a paper out this past week, suicide rates for 10 to 14-year-old girls. There are two populations where suicide rates are rising in the United States. Kind of middle-aged white men, as you've been hearing, largely veterans, rising, and 10 to 14-year-old girls. It is, for those of you who have been through it, it is, as I have with my daughters, it is this developmental regularity, but it can be harrowing, right? And our culture doesn't like to talk about it. And what the movie did in this amazing way is say, look, this girl is going through something normative. One of the first questions I was asked is Riley depressed? I'm like, no, she's not depressed. She's sad about losing her childhood because she had this spectacular childhood. Family life is filled with conflict. A lot of the developmental estimates suggest that there are 12 to 15 conflicts an hour in like a family of like Riley and her parents. And then she is moving through what teenagers, preteens do, which is a massive shift in identity, where it is very painful not to get to play rough monkey with your dad, or not to laugh with your parents, or to push them away. Parents, do I have parents of any teens in the room or preteens? How many of you are like sort of tearing up every now and then? You're like, you reach out to kiss your child goodbye, and they're like, ugh. That just happens to everybody. And so what the film really, and I wrote a New York Times piece on this, I said, look, our culture pathologizes sadness. That's not always been the case. When my daughter was sad and anxious, I had every kind of medical expert trying to give her pharmaceuticals with no data on that exercise. No data, right? And I was like, well, let's just embrace it. Let's ride it out, see where it goes. It becomes a rich part of your character. And I think what the film tells us, in a way beyond the science, is, that girls, why is they lose the warm surround of the family because they're moving into the next phase of life. And that sadness, sadness makes things sacred. And in the end of the movie, sadness adds so much depth to her memories and her wisdom. She comforts Bing Bong, Didn't you love Bing Bong? I know. When I saw the screening in Hollywood, I was sitting next to this little 3 or 4-year-old guy, and like when Bing Bong was disappearing, he literally stood up on his chair and he's like, "Dad, not Bing Bong!" And I was like, "Man, Pixar knows how to do it," And of course, that fits what we're learning from the science, which is it's not good to suppress negative emotions. James Gross, Bob Levinson, Iris Mouse in my department, Matt Lieberman over at UCLA, just labeling negative emotions with words and concepts sort of reduces the amygdala-based activation associated with the negative emotion. Just narrating experience is helpful. In the mindfulness literature, if you can accept and be non-judgmentally aware of tough stuff in life, pain, disease, death, sadness, you will do better. Here's just one study of a mindfulness study just showing over time, as I mindfully accept tough stuff in life, I have lower levels of IL-6, which is a marker of the cytokine response, the inflammation response, have less anxiety just by acceptance. Finally, I think what and it'd be neat to hear what Sonia has to say about this and some of our happiness scholars, but, and I think that we are in the literature coming to the idea that you need all the emotions to be fully engaged in life. June Gruber is writing about this, my former student, and also another former student, Alex Kogan or Spector. I remember talking to, Pete and Ronnie and the team as they started to really grapple with negative emotions like anger, right, or sadness. Aristotle's idea from the Nicomachean Ethics, basically saying we need all the emotions. They have their place. As long as they're in the right place and context and time and towards the right target, it's his idea of the golden mean, which is we need all of these passions that we have to be virtuous. The thing that was really gratifying to hear in the movie is this is really kind of an idea in the emotion literature coming out of Dick Lazarus's thinking, some of our work, my work with Jen Lerner, that emotions are these principled, sensible ways of looking at the world in the moment. They help you adapt to different situations. Anger is about unfairness, and we need that emotion when things are unfair, and it drives social change, right? So you'll see that. I did my own little exercise on emotional diversity, now a paper under review. I'll talk about this later. It's a partnership I've had with Facebook that Ethan referred to. They asked us to redraw some emoticons or emoji. And whenever I look at the emoticons, I get mad. I'm just like, I don't look like I have poop coming out of my mouth. Why would I send that to somebody or whatever it is? So at the time, there's a guy working on Inside Out, Matt Jones, who's a spectacular artist now living in Southern California. I said, hey, Matt, here are a bunch of states. Just start drawing them. And he just started drawing emojis. And you start to see some of the great emotions in there. And he does this like within a second. You can actually take these emojis or these initial drawings and fax code them with Ekman and Friesen's facial action coding system. I just love the nuances here. Look at that admiring smile. It isn't a typical smile. It's kind of like, wow, there's Phil Zimbardo. I feel so admiring of Phil. There's awe. There's that coy display. There's sympathy and the like. We turn these into a sticker pack at Facebook. By the way, the most frequently sent sticker is the far right, which is love. And the culture that most sends the love display is Italy, where Phil Zimbardo comes from. So, and you just love, here they are. Oh, I don't have these animated. Okay. We then did some with Alex Spector, some big data. You could find out, like, what do cultures send to each other? To draw your attention to the validity of this, the redder the country, the more they send the emotion, the sticker. This is hundreds of millions of people. Notice the distinction between Canada and the United States. And then here's anger. Here's awe. We are a very awe-prone culture, which is interesting, as is Russia, which is kind of... Then you can score what a wide array of emotions do you use? Do you use the full palette of emotions? Or do you drive your friends nuts by only sending the little happy face? The redder the country, the wider the array of emoticons that they send in terms of emotion. And that, at the nation level, these are all nations, correlates with how long you live and how happy you are. So the wider the array of emotions, like Pixar, we need them all, and they all have their uses. So I'm about to turn it over to you guys, but it's really, I do feel that this science of emotion, this is just part of it. Later today, I'll talk about shifts. There are just a lot of things that are happening that are rooted in our science. And for you young scholars out there, one of the things we should be actively engaged in is taking what we learn in rigorous science and then applying it to what's out in the world. One of the privileges, I've been going to San Quentin Prison in a restorative justice program. Later, I'll talk about a brief I wrote for a case against solitary confinement. You don't need to hear the full story to know solitary confinement is a violation not only of Amendment 8, cruel and unusual punishment, but everything that evolved in our human emotional repertoire to make us connect to others. They just blow it to pieces, and we won that case. There's a lot of interesting work now with veterans. There's a lot of stuff in schools. And even Steve Pinker arguing why have we seen this decline of violence in 500 years, said it's because we've become more empathetic through literature and film and the like. For me, what was really interesting, just the deeper lesson, is, we scientists, we love the full story, right? And we go after the complexities of truth, right? Which is, and we end up talking like, well, if you're going to portray the emotions in the human mind, you need 18, and there are about 212 interactions, and they mix, and then they are appropriate in certain places and not others. And by then, the artists are like, this guy is boring, right? And artists love narratives, and sometimes narratives cut out your favorite emotions or certain facets of scientific truth. There are places very clearly where Inside Out abandoned science and said, nope, we got to tell a good story. And that was the really great deeper lesson of the movie. Now, for those of you out there who are planning, this is Southern California, and you're thinking about, hey, I'm going to do a movie based on science. We've got a lot of good stuff at the Greater Good Science Center for free. Our MOOC had 400,000 people enroll in the science of happiness. greatergood.berkeley.edu has tons that we've been building it up for 15 years. We've just launched Greater Good in Action, and we've got a lot of people in this. Phil has been a consistent member of our team. Sonia, who's in the room, is profiled a lot in our stuff. GGIA, if you're interested in like science-based practices for example, feeling more awe to help with trauma, we've got stuff there. And there's the cover of my new book that comes out in a couple of weeks. So thank you very much. So I think we have 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes, yeah, 15 minutes to take your questions and observations. I've learned a lot. I've talked about the movie to grammar school audiences and the like, so what questions do you have? And how are we going to, yes?
Can you talk about a scene where they went away from the science to tell about a better story?
Yeah, so, where did they abandon the science? So the islands of personality, right? We know from people like Oliver John, obviously personality is this complicated, structures of traits, and then those shape more specific strategies. Those are then occurring within an attachment profile. It's a very complicated thing. And I think that they chose 5 islands, I think it was, that were really different, right? It was Friendship Island and Goofball Island. So they really moved away from how scientists would describe the structure of identity to what really worked for their narrative. And both are sensible. It'd be if you had the big 5, no offense to my dear friend Oliver John, but like if the movie had the big 5, like here's conscientiousness, and it's about being on time, and keeping your pencil sharpened, and it'd be like, why am I seeing this movie? So they made very, and I talked to them about that, and they're like, that's good. I'm glad you guys have that, but Goofball Island is the real magic. So, yes.
Why was fear and anger male in Riley's mind when in the mother's mind every emotion
Yeah.
was female, and in the father's mind every emotion was male?
Yeah, and they took a certain amount of heat on the gender issue, so they did have, the emotions in the parents are very gendered, so it's only female emotions in the mom and male emotions in the dad. And then in 11-year-old Riley, sadness is female, Phyllis Smith, and anger is male. And they were aware of that, and they thought about it, and they thought, Could, like an 11-year-old girl is probably more androgynous. Could you have a more complicated gender portrayal? Could you have them only be female? And I think that they made that choice because they felt that the dramatic impact would be greater by gendering those emotions. There is a little scientific validity to that claim. Men tend to get a little bit more angry. Women tend to cry a little bit more. 88% of acts of violence in the world are male. So there is some validity to that, but you could critique it for a gender misrepresentation. And I think, that what was interesting was, it's a Pixar movie, right? And 5-year-olds are seeing it. And I tried to push them on some issues like that. It would be really interesting to really do an androgynous emotion artistically. And that probably would be truer. But they're making a movie for Disney. So they had to, there are certain conventions that constrain them. Yeah. Yes.
Another gender question. Could Pixar have done this movie about an 11-year-old male?
Yeah, definitely. And it would have been, it would have been just a radically different movie. And the kids, he would have been banging around and wrestling a lot. And, she wrestled a lot, which I liked. And then, they would have brought into focus some of that. As I said, Pete and Ronnie have had very intense relationships with their daughters, and we're really interested in what happens to a preteen girl, and I think it's a very important question. Yeah.
Would you say that this anthropomorphic model would be effective in talking about non-normative development in young adults, like anxiety or depression?
I do, and that's a really important question. Their first commitment, and when you think about how they portrayed the mind, obviously emotions aren't little people in your head. They're complex, distributed processes that you could portray artistically, but they wanted it to be characters. And I get an email every week, and more frequently from people who are dealing with trauma and emotional disorders, and parents who have kids dealing with emotional variations, and they say this movie transformed how they can relate to their condition. I had a mom whose boy was very Asperger's, and she said, he's 13 or 14, she said, this is the first time he's been able to talk about emotion. I had a female executive this week, I don't know what day it is, 2 days ago, whom I was teaching, who works in Silicon Valley, and she said, I had a traumatic childhood, and I saw the movie 6 times, and it changed my trauma. So I think and there are people who will be working on how this will become a tool, those kinds of tools. It's a great question. Yes?
Did they consider using like neurochemistry, anything like that, to relate to the emotions?
They did, and so how did the neuroscience figure into this? And they were there are a couple of ways. I talked for a full hour with them about oxytocin, dopamine, some of the stuff that we know about serotonin, the inflammation response. So they got that, and Pete really dug into the current understanding of the neurophysiology, neurochemical correlates of emotion. And one of the ways in which it influenced their thinking, and they were very proud of this, and ironically, I didn't even notice it the first time I saw the movie, is they felt like the visual imagery of the characters, when they really become drivers of the narrative, look like kind of synaptic communications, right? So they kind of have this glow to them, and they start to bubble up a little on their surface of their skin. So they felt like that was one attempt. And then they also grappled a bit about the structure of the mind and where memories go based on neuroscience. So neuroscience is always a part of their conversation, and Pete took it really seriously, which was great. Sonia.
Can you speak a little bit to a bit of controversy that happened after the movie came out in our field of social psychology, where Lisa Feldman Barrett kind of wrote that the movie was misleading in
Wow, that's it. Yeah, I think it was, well, first of all, since you've asked the question, Lisa's critique is there aren't distinct emotions. That's wrong. I just showed you a bunch of data that, we've got 15 vocal bursts that are universal, and you see them all over the world. And if you heard a sympathy vocalization from a non-human primate, you would know what that is, right? So she's overstated that case. And now the data with new data analytic techniques are showing a lot of specificity in the autonomic nervous system, central nervous system. So that was the scientific foundation of her critique, and that's, in my estimation, misguided. And then I think that, you could say, and I think that it relates to one of your questions, like emotions aren't people in your head. They are, and Lisa would be right here, they are distributed processes that move through your nervous system. But there are distinctions and patterns to them. And that was a narrative decision. And then, I chose not to respond to that because I think in a way the response to the film was the real verdict on whether it was successful or not. And people learned an enormous amount from the film. Phil.
Given the success of the film, what's next for Pixar and you?
Yeah, so I actually got called, it's become this new, I just got called by a director who's making the next version of The Invisible Man, and Johnny Depp's interest is going to be in it. I'm like, I'll be there. Because Johnny Depp is best friends with my hero, Iggy Pop, so this is my chance to meet Iggy Pop. But it's a fascinating question that they're asking, which is, what is your identity like if no one can see your face, right? And we know scientifically it is very hard to live without your face and your voice and emotional communication. And then I'm talking to Pete about his next movie, just, being, again, a scientific consultant. But I think the real action is going to be in the sequel. And I hope they go big, because if Riley, I'm like, Pete, here's my image. Like, Riley's 18. She's off to Berkeley. She's going to be an undergrad. She's in the front row of a concert. Stuff's happening. Let's film, right? And, because then you could really get into the next stage of, and I think there will be a sequel. It's not his next movie. It'll be 5 years from now, and I bet it'll be spectacular. Thank you, Phil.
Does Iggy moon somebody?
Does what?
Does Iggy moon somebody?
He'll make an appearance in the movie. Other questions? Yes?
What's your favorite emotion personally and in regards to research?
Yeah. It's so funny because one of the things that this movie spurred is this question of like, what's my emotion? Or what's my favorite emotion? And, as I've told you, I think that Pete has this really important relationship to sadness. He moved with his family when he was 11, lost his friendships. He moved to Europe. He was very sad about his daughter's development and getting older and moving away from him. He was a very devoted dad. And that's his emotion, and it's why he's such a spectacular artist. My favorite emotions are sympathy and awe, and I love laughter. I think mirth and amusement is the most underrated virtue out there, and why Pixar is so important. Maybe 2 more questions, Ethan? Okay. 2 more questions. Yes?
During the research from the when you showed the slide about the compassion and intention and the ability for males to convey certain emotions, is there any other some emotions that visibly they have trouble conveying to female or vice versa?
That's a complicated, deep question. You and I should talk about this at a break. Well, I think part of the striking revolution of this. So scientifically, we know, for example, and I started seeing this in my research, like men don't like to say they're embarrassed, and I would do studies where a man would be blushing bright red and sort of fumbling and touching himself and look like this is as embarrassed as a human could be. I'm like, and how did you feel? And he's like, fine, you know. And I'm like, come on, you know. And then I think that back to, you know, and so I think people would say that emotions where you're vulnerable, men will have a little bit more trouble with. It's probably true scientifically. And then I think what was really important about the movies, it said, hey, sadness is part of the game. And now we are in the middle of a really interesting shift that this movie was part of. So, you know, political leaders, John Boehner, when he stepped down, cried, right? Obama, when he won the election and visited his office in Chicago, hugged like 500 people, right? Just that was his visit. So there is this interesting transformation that, because sadness used to be very hard to be for a man to express, and the movie changed that. One more question. Yes?
At the risk of changing topic here, but as a young faculty member who's aspiring to be a fantastic instructor, I'll take your advice and ask you, what is Dr. Zimbardo like on the softball field?
Thank you. He's embarrassed right now. Man, so, you know, I'm going to just say thank you to Phil with this little story, because Phil was on my dissertation committee and has, you know, Phil was, we used to have this belief, I don't think you guys believe this, that as a scientist, a social scientist, you couldn't really talk to the public about your work. We used to believe that and it would cost you. And B, you couldn't use your science to help society, because that would almost be committing that what we would call the naturalistic fallacy. Science shouldn't say what we should do, it should just describe things. And as a lot of people have argued since, we've sort of discarded those constraints, and I think for the better of our world. And Phil, you know, really risked his career, and he really did that pioneering work saying, I have a great scientific career, but I'm going to use this science to get a conversation going out in the public with his PBS work, with a textbook, and all the other stuff that he does. So why I'm up here today is in part because of Phil. What I loved about Phil, you have to realize Phil grew up in the Bronx, am I correct? And is one tough mofo. And I will tell my favorite Phil Zimbardo story that taught me how to be a faculty member. We used to have this game at Stanford, softball game. Phil was the best hitter. I was close to you, but Phil was the best power hitter, and it was spectacular. Like Gordon Bauer would pitch, and Phil would smack it over the fence, and Gordon didn't handle it well because he wanted to be a baseball pitcher. Phil was a spectacular hitter, but he was a fiery spirit. And one time we had this game going, and Phil was on the other side, and I was playing defense, and they had the bases loaded. And somebody hit a weak grounder in the infield, and we made a Keystone Cops-like sequence of 6 errors that allowed the entire bases to clear. And each error was a more spectacular mistake than the last. Like, okay, I'm going to throw it to you, get it. And I'm like, and then somebody would get it and throw it and go backwards, and somebody would fall down. And as this play unfolded, I don't know if you remember this, Phil, Phil was on the sidelines, and he started acting like a gorilla. Like, look at you guys playing baseball! And he was imitating us and making fun of us, because he loves laughter and good spirit. And at the end of that play, one of our really uptight grad students went up to Phil and was like, got really mad at Phil, and Phil's like, calm down, man, this is a game, you know, and didn't back down. And that told me, you always treat things as a game, and you have a lot of fire, like Phil. So, yeah, it was really, we owe a lot to Phil. Thank you so much. Have fun.